I look upon the Buddha as a kind of spiritual scientist, a great innovative spiritual scientist. Shall we say the Isaac Newton of spirituality? After Newton appeared in the world, science really got going. Newton made some major innovations that set the course for science as we, or at least physical science as we now know it. The Buddha made a number of original discoveries that I think are as good as gold. They will stand the test of time in terms of the issue of ultimate human happiness and human spirituality. One of those discoveries was the principle of untangle and be free, which I sometimes, in a somewhat more politically incorrect phraseology, like to describe as divide and conquer. Some people they don't like that language, but divide and conquer means if you can break the complicated system into its natural components, you will conquer ignorance, suffering, and the screwed up behaviors that come from ignorance and suffering. So divide and conquer actually is a nice phrase, but if you prefer the more gentle untangle and be free, we can use that phraseology also. In traditional Buddhist scriptures, early Buddhist scriptures, the Pali Canon, there are actually a number of systems or schemes for dividing and conquering the suffering self. One of them is the five aggregate scheme. The other one is another one is the four foundations of mindfulness, and another one is the four great elements: earth, water, air, and fire, or wind and fire. These were looked upon in those days as sort of basic components of the world. I think it's important not to get fixated on a particular traditional classification scheme, but rather to generalize the Buddha's discovery and realize that there are any number of ways of dividing the pie of self so that you can apply this general or basic principle of untangle and be free. So the untangle and be free discovery basically says that when the elements that produce the sense of self are not distinct in awareness, they create qualitative and quantitative illusions that magnify the sense of suffering, and that would be on the quantitative side. And on the qualitative side, even more important actually, produce an illusory quality within us. That illusory quality is the perception that there is a thing called a self inside us. So when you untangle the strands, then the somethingness of self goes away, which, by the way, frees up the doingness of personality. So you don't have to worry that you're going to lose something by untangling and being free. I use this classification system to apply the general principle of untangle and be free. I don't typically use the five aggregates of traditional Buddhism for a number of reasons. They're a little bit hard for beginning meditators to use practically. In fact, I don't think I know of a single teacher that actually has people make the deconstruction of the self the center of practice based on the five aggregates. can generalize the concept of untangling the aggregates to untangling other types of components that are pretty closely related. So we could say that a core sense of subjective self arises in the feel, image, talk system. So I sometimes refer to that as the subjective self or the feeling, thinking self. The thinking part is in the image and talk. The feel part is here in the body. So to the extent that you can track these in real time and keep them from tangling together, to that extent the subjective self will be a home, not a prison. A little broader formulation would be what I refer to as body-mind self. In that formulation, anything that happens in the body is a part of self, and anything that happens in the mind is part of self. So from that somewhat broader perspective, we have touch, feel, image, talk. This is body, and this is mind. So I have people learn how to track these four and separate them. When people work just with the core subjective self, I call that technique focus in, because you're working with the innermost components. This is sort of my contemporary reworking of things like the 4 foundations of mindfulness or the 5 aggregates and so forth. After one separates out these elements, what's next? Well, there's more to the deconstruction than simply the untangling of the strands. One then looks very carefully at each individual strand, and a unifying principle arises. So here we have distinction. We distinguish subjective object versus objective. We distinguish somatic versus visual versus auditory. We distinguish ordinary versus restful. After you've teased out these sensory strands and look very carefully at them individually, you'll see that they're all made out of the same stuff. After productive kinds of discriminations are made, further careful observation brings us to a productive unification. Turns out that all of these sensory experiences are, upon very close investigation, seen to be made out of the same stuff, except it's not stuff. It's a verb, not a noun. It's a doing of that could be described as a vibrant vacuity. So the vacuity is a kind of transparency or refreshing nothingness, and the vibrance is a kind of dynamic flow upon which we ride and live our life in a bouncy and enthusiastic way, having seen beyond life.